There are two common pitfalls that I see people fall into when they are deconstructing or re-examining beliefs. And maybe the most dangerous aspect of these pitfalls is the fact that they are sometimes mistaken for the work of deconstruction. So let's take a look at these pitfalls together, and I will show you what they are, how to avoid them, and how you can get out of them if you've already fallen for the traps. In the first video of this series, we talked about what deconstruction is as well as what it is not. And we also talked about how, regardless of what we call it, deconstruction, or this mindful re-examining of our beliefs and practices, is actually an important part of spiritual development. The end goal is better understanding and more ownership of our beliefs. But we get thrown terribly off course from that goal when we practice, instead of deconstruction, demolition or devaluing. Demolition is the word that I use for tearing down of beliefs or our ideas or ideals about God or about ourselves or about the world. It is a tearing down that is done in such a way that it leaves little room for spirituality to exist at all, much less thrive. Maybe a better way to explain it is demolition is basically like taking a sledgehammer to something instead of, when we needed a screwdriver, to just take it apart and carefully examine what was going on so we could make the repair. And yes, I do realize that's probably the most lesbian way that I could explain that to you. Now, demolition might look like trying to find weak points, to poke holes in somebody's arguments. It might even mean trying to discredit beliefs or practices. It's really seeking to tear down instead of understand or make connections. And honestly, for so many of us who were from this fundamentalist sort of a tradition, we're pretty well versed in this type of thinking and this type of tactic in arguing with people. In fact, there's even a name and training for it. It's called apologetics. And really what's happening when we engage in demolition and we start to tear down, we are engaging in just another style of that. Apologetics might be the way that a more fundamentalist person might try to poke holes in someone's logic to try to get them to believe in God, where someone who is approaching it from a more demolishing and demolition perspective might be trying to make someone not believe because they are trying to tear it down in the same way that someone else might be trying to supplant a belief in someone else's mind. We can take demolition one step further and begin to practice what I call devaluing. Devaluing is the willful neglect and discarding of anything and everything spiritual. This is both within ourselves and within other people. It is different than changing our beliefs in that it requires a severing of ourselves, a severing of one piece of ourselves from the rest of us. And when we devalue, it means that we are refusing to acknowledge the worth of something or someone. In this case, refusing to acknowledge the worth of a part of ourselves. It might look like belittling other people. It might mean mockery. It might mean shaming other people who are spiritual or religious. It might take the form of direct or indirect hostility and attacks. It can even be self-shaming for having spiritual needs and having spiritual inclinations. Another part might be discarding this piece of ourselves and refusing to acknowledge that we are worthy of full attention and full integration within our selfhood. Devaluing can lead to intense experiences of grief. It can lead to cynicism. It can also lead to numbing or emotional blunting, and it can lead to fractures in our relationship, both with ourselves and with other people. There is a story within one of Aesop's fables that is a story about the fox and the grapes. And in this story, there's a fox who tries and tries and tries to reach these grapes. And when he ultimately cannot reach them, he decides to say, well, those grapes were probably sour anyway. Who would want those? This story makes me sad because not only does it highlight the real practice of devaluing, but it also shows how we can rob ourselves of experiences of joy and pleasure in the future. Because what if this fox comes up on some more grapes and he decides not to try because he's made up his mind that the grapes are probably gross and sour anyway? What if he decides to never give it a chance and he's missing out on a great opportunity of something that could have been pretty incredible for him? So often we rob ourselves of that joy, and so often we are the spoilers of joy and peace and clarity for other people when we decide that they should discard and devalue also, and we start to try to push beliefs on them. Now, if either demolition or devaluing feel really familiar to you and you see yourself in them and you know that you've been practicing them, don't worry. It's not too late. You can start to practice a more mindful approach instead. I'm going to show you 3 steps for how you can get out of these negative thinking traps or avoid them altogether. Step number 1, watch your language. And I'm not talking about swearing. You can swear all day for all I care. But what I'm talking about is watching how you talk about beliefs and practices, making sure that you are speaking in a way that supports a more mindful approach, making sure that you're leaving room to preserve connection with your spirit so that you're not discarding and you're not demolishing. So sticking away from language that tears down, language that is more rigid in its thinking style, which leads me to point number 2. Number 2 is to check your thoughts. Check your thoughts for rigid, black and white, all or nothing kind of thinking. If you aren't seeing the nuance and the gray in things, chances are you have more of a risk of falling into the thinking trap of demolition or devaluing. Now, while our culture tends to thrive on this style of thinking in our current time, it serves nobody, especially when it comes to spirituality. So if you find yourself thinking in this really rigid way, or what I sometimes refer to as a fundamentalist or binary style of thinking, then the best thing that you can do is to stop yourself and ask, is there any other way that I can look at this? Are there other perspectives? What would a nuanced or gray sort of way be to look at this situation or this idea? And number 3, spend some time connecting with your own spirit, whether it's creating some art, spending some time in nature, maybe having a deep conversation with someone you care about, journaling, meditating, anything that you do that makes you feel alive, that makes you feel connected with yourself, and that makes you feel connected with something bigger than you. That's spirituality. And sometimes it helps to just give our minds a break from overthinking, to take a little bit of that pressure off whenever we are really just re-examining some religious beliefs and practices, when we can engage our spirits outside of that religion, outside of maybe the spiritual practices that we're used to that are associated with religion. We're offering ourselves a chance to connect with our spirit in a really low pressure way. And that connection offers us some grounding, and it can give you some clarity when you're trying to figure out these questions, when you're trying to re-examine beliefs and trying to decide what you want to hold on to versus what you don't. Staying connected with your spirit can help you to see the value that's there, so you won't fall into the trap of complete demolition or devaluing. Next time, we will dive a little bit deeper into some specific reflections and exercises that you can do as you are mindfully re-examining your beliefs without falling into these traps that we talked about today. So be sure to like this video if it's been helpful for you and subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss the next video. See you next time, and thank you so much for being here.